Good morning, everybody. My name is Kathy Frankel. I'm the Deputy Director of Interpretive Content, a new title, sorry, here at the museum. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, April de Simone. April is a transdisciplinary practitioner working at the intersection of architecture, planning, and systems thinking. Her work is inspired by her experiences growing up in the Bronx and steeped in collateral consequences of intentionally designed systems of inequity. In partnership with diverse stakeholders, she seeks to advance equitable, humane, and just frameworks and projects shaping the conditions of our society. It is my great pleasure to welcome April to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. So great to be here. Before I begin, I just want to give a huge acknowledgement to the entire team at the National Building Museum. One, for allowing this pop-up Democracy Is to be present, as well as this opportunity to talk about these values of equity, freedom, justice, and liberty in a way that, again, incorporates in a spatialized setting versus this rhetorical nods and gestures of democracy that we're used to. Okay, sorry. When we think of home, I'm gonna ask, it's been a busy morning, for each of you to close your eyes and wonder what comes to mind when you feel home. Do you think of children playing outside, neighbors on your front stoop, talking up the chat? Do you think of good smells or block parties? Now replace that concept of home with living in a burnt-out house with 3 rooms, with a kerosene heater and no running hot water. I can tell you indirectly what this summit is posing. What do communities and neighborhoods lose when housing is unaffordable? Housing, as FDR had highlighted in his 4 Freedoms speech, is the vein of American democracy. Home, as we know, is where the heart is. We stand to gain much, but we lose far more when we don't honor the principles of equity, inclusion, and justice when it comes to housing. I strongly believe that housing is a system of the built environment. That system informs our societal conditions. It also directly correlates to how democracy is in practice. When people show up to their home, it tells a larger story of zip codes. This concept of equity has to move beyond just a unit of home and understand that this pursuit is far more than just that one unit. Housing operates within an ecology and an ecosystem. That ecosystem is shaped squarely on how we perceive people. How we perceive people creates the relationships, connections, and power dynamics that we have. And those relationships build the policies, practices, and investments that, again, create this lived experience that informs this concept of pursuit of home. I can also tell you directly, through my personal experience, the consequences when housing is unaffordable. It begins right after the plantation. My mother grew up in a town called Santurce, Puerto Rico. This was her concept of home. Raw sewage, planks for sidewalks, shacks, no different from the chicken coop story that we just heard. With her identity in hand, many of you who don't know, Puerto Ricans are US citizens, just in case, and we did census there. And COL stands for colored. So my mother was a Black Puerto Rican who, with her identity, landed in Harlem in the 1940s. Landing in Harlem, the conditions that they thought they were escaping from their town led them to another reality of these systems. Yet, despite that, there was this hope that democracy and we the people applied to them as well. Every day she worked, she got up, and she made a life for herself. When she graduated from nursing school as an LPN in Harlem, she thought that she could too have a slice of this American pie. As the Bronx was transitioning from the white flight, new opportunities opened up in the Bronx, New York, so that people like my mother can take advantage of it. And she really believed that by working hard and showing up, that she can create this concept of home. When she moved to the neighborhood, the second house in from the left was what the home looked like. It was a vibrant community. It was intact. But little did she know when she purchased this home at the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, that 30 years prior, a decision had been made around desirability and where investments were going to go and not go. And shortly after she moved in, the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway came in. It destroyed the community, and it began to unravel the social fabric. When I was 4 years old, her dream of home and pursuing this concept of rootedness was abruptly disrupted through fires. 90% of the neighborhood that I was born and raised in went up in fire, and it literally was rubble. As we know, President Carter had gone and said it looked like World War II. To me, this is a grand indictment to our democracy. Why is it that we reinforce these hierarchies of human value within the built environment around terminology of low income, middle income, luxury, that reinforms segregation in our society, particularly economic segregation? So this is the home I grew up in, because my mother's cry for help went unanswered. Through no fault of her own, her home caught on fire. And this is all we had. What happens when these situations or these systems, again, repeatedly show their inequity? This is a capturing of the image of my neighborhood, my blocks. I personified democracy when I would play on these blocks, because in the moment in the morning, I would go pledge allegiance to the flag and feel justice and liberty for all. And then I would come home at that age and wonder, well, why does my neighborhood look like this? Not everyone's neighborhood looks like this. How does this happen? But I believe that someone was going to make it right, just like FDR did with the New Deal policies. He made it right. No one ever came. After the fires and the uprisings, on the heels of that, we had the heroin epidemic in our community, which was heavily criminalized instead of treated, unlike today's opioid epidemic. On the heels of the heroin epidemic, we had the HIV epidemic in our community. My father succumbed to HIV-related consequences or illnesses at the age of 49. On the heels of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we had the crack epidemic in my community. On the heels of the crack epidemic, we had unprecedented violence. And the messaging that was given to my family was just say no. How do you say no and then expect me to steward the ideologies and principles at the foundation of this great nation that we send people to die for? It was an unraveling after we lost our home. We bounced from 8 different homes. I eventually ended up in a homeless shelter. I was homeless for approximately 3 months. It was one of the worst homeless shelters on 151st Street in the Bronx, so notorious that Giuliani himself, then mayor, closed it down. Think about the conditions of living in raw sewage, rats, unsafe situations. Feel that for a moment. Can you show me, by your show of hands, how many of you have lived in sewage, rat-infested places? In 2022, my husband, who is an officer of the military, who also is a federal agent, and again puts his life on the line, decided, because we can no longer afford to live in New York, move to Trenton, New Jersey. Upon our decision to buy in Trenton, which has over or close to 4,000 vacancies, I fell in love with Trenton. It reminded me of my old block, my neighborhood, where I grew up. The people were so warm, that ambition, that talent. It hadn't been gentrified like my Bronx community. It hadn't been erased, and it was worth preserving. We went through this arduous process to apply for a mortgage. We were approved, and with that approval in hand, went and started looking at homes. We met Mr. Jones, who was the owner of 27 Perdicaris. I fell in love with Mr. Jones. He was the third owner again of this place in a formerly segregated area and took such pride in this home. Was offered $500,000 cash from someone from New York to purchase it, and he said no. I want to keep this in a virtuous cycle in my community. When he met my husband and I, we spent hours talking on his porch.
The story is, when I was a kid, I used to ride my bike up and down these streets.
Wow.
But you weren't supposed to ride up and down those streets from what I was told as a kid. Yeah, because it was a majority of white people.
Okay.
And they didn't want black folks on their street.
Okay.
Time went on. I, of course, got dressed up, went to work, shirt, tie, whatever, came back, knocked on the door. This woman came to, Betty was her name. So she said, "Can I help you?" I said, "My name is Terry Jones, and I like your house. I've always liked it as a kid, and if you ever want to sell it, you know." I had a Rita's water ice receipt that I gave her and wrote my number on the back.
With our approval in hand, we put an offer in for Mr. Jones's home. We were so excited to do this together and in journey with him. Our approval letter was for $800,000. When we went back to the bank and we said 27 is our desire, that's what's desirable for us, not Princeton, which is 15 minutes away from this home, but Trenton was my level or definition of desirability. Immediately after informing them of 27, the loan was reduced to $665,000. I said, "Well, I'm not going to borrow $800, but you do know this sounds like redlining. Because if I qualify through my income, if I qualify through all the arduous things you've put me through to get this letter, why can't I have freedom of choice to spend my money where I want to spend it? It's a free market, isn't it? So where's my choice?" The night before the closing, I received a call that the amount, the house itself was only $300,000, but of course, because of decades of disinvestment, as a result of the policies we're all too familiar with, it needed about $325,000 worth of repair. That's well within my budget. The taxes were amazing, and it was an opportunity to create roots. Literally, at 4:30, I was told they could not find comps in the area to qualify me for the amount that was necessary. I was enraged. I called everyone, and by me, I know everyone. And I hope to get to know all you. And no one had a solution for me. All this talk about black and brown home ownership, All this talk about rootedness and equity in our communities, all this bumping of gums. But now, when I needed someone to show up, there was no one. We postponed the closing, and we tried again, and I was determined to try to find a solution. But there was none. I was given a loan for $360,000 in a home that would cost $625,000, despite being approved for $800,000. Is that democracy? Is that freedom? You come up with these fancy formulas, home to loan ratio, value, resale value. When you attach all those superficial data metrics to this concept of home, you destroy communities, particularly communities that have historically been disinvested in. We pursued forward, and there was a reality. And I said to Mr. Jones, I'm trying. I've called everyone. I've tried. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to do this. Perhaps we can do it somewhere else, and you can still be part of that journey. He insisted, no, this was meant for you, that we're going to make it happen. Have faith, it'll happen. It did not happen. And again, when you look at the conditions of these homes, they need a lot of repair. Mr. Jones and I set up a meeting after Thanksgiving, and I received a call the very next day that Mr. Jones had passed away. It broke my heart. I was so angry that this person who has worked his entire life could not even see the selling of his home to enjoy the things that he wanted to do with what he earned. Think about what we have lost in just that story. His family was left in disarray, and at that point, it was a moral conscious choice on my part. Do I walk away on top of all the patience that Mr. Jones had for us and leave his family in that condition? And I just couldn't. I just could not do it. They could not get a conventional loan because of the condition of the home, so the construction loan was all that they qualified for. Finally, on December 22nd, we closed on the house, situated his wife, and because a home for our community is extended family members. It isn't this cookie cutter of just the one family living in a home. It's multi-generational living in a home because that's what we can afford. So once they were secured, we turned and doubled down on 27. On January 2nd, we walked in. My husband screams from the basement, and we go downstairs, and we see all of this water in the basement. Now, of course, as working in the field of architecture, I knew there was water issues with the house. I did not know where they were coming from. So we were going to troubleshoot. What I did not know was that this was actually raw sewage. And it created another rage inside of me, because I remember Mr. Jones talking about the water and he going downstairs with his bare hands and wet vacuuming that out of the basement. In 2023, is this what democracy looks like? When we dug up the basement, the image shows what was the infrastructure of this home. We have an infrastructure bill down the pipeline again with the blasey around equity. But this was what the infrastructure, there were no pipes. The pipes are on display in the exhibition, or portion of them. In honor of Mr. Jones, I'm pursuing and going forward This does not have to be this way. Our conditions of our neighborhoods, this concept of housing, can be very different. Again, I pull back to the moment when FDR, when most of the people who are now considered middle class were just, as Whitney M. Young said in his 1968 speech to the AIA, just the paycheck away from the Hoovervilles they came from, benefited from the New Deal policies. It was a policy that created the American middle class. We've found ways to reinvigorate housing and gave everyone a sense of home. And many gained, particularly as we see today with the $85 trillion that will be passed down as a result of those opportunities of the American middle class. People like my mother could not get loans when they purchased homes because of their identity. So they had to rely on predatory practices that still exist today. I'm in one of them. What do we have to gain when we really create housing affordability for all? How do we create new systems within our built environment that address these historical policies that have forever imprinted in so many different ways the spatial footprint of America? What does it actually mean to spatialize equity beyond a unit of housing? That when you step outside of that unit of housing, what is your neighborhood like? How do we heal this past instead of reinforcing these same dynamics? That's at the core of the work I'm doing with the practice of democracy. It really is looking at how do we spatialize these concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Through public engagement, through conceptual design projects, we really take the effort with our clients to look at when there's a parcel of land here, how do we envision something so different? And that in and of itself is equity. I can't tell you how many people I speak with in the housing industry. It's always a churning, like a chattel house. It's never the stopping to see what you're doing now will impact several generations down the line. Pause and reflect on what you're doing and how can we do it better. We're in the process, because of this whole experience, and of course 9 generations of the same conditions within the finance community, to create VESI, which is a neighborhood equity fund. There are similar models that do so, that create this opportunity to internally create mortgages and restoration funds. So VESI will be doing it for disinvested communities. How can we take PRI and MRI investments, close gaps with restoration, but really create stopgaps, like right of first refusal and beyond? So that's what we're going to prototype with the 27 House, so that people behind me, if I choose to sell, have the opportunity to live in a diverse neighborhood. Not what I have dealt with in the Bronx, where a home was sold for $300,000 and now is $3 million. It's economic redlining, and that's what we're creating when we come into these communities. If any of you in this audience like to fund progressive ideas, I'd love to talk to you. If you want to partner, if you want to connect, we can create this virtuous cycle that's very different. Again, we can heal what has happened in the past. We can deconstruct the social constructs of race and human value within the built environment. We can really create a different ideology that children, a 9-year-old coming in your stoop and saying hi, has hope to connect to something in the future. I can't tell you how many teenagers I work with have said to me, with 2 master's degrees, one in architecture, you can't afford to buy a home and create home. What chance is it for me? Very hard, Miss April, to believe in this concept of equity, equality, we the people, justice. But I'm going to keep showing up beyond the rhetoric, beyond the nods to the monuments, and really try to plot something forward and invoke that energy of FDR. I invite you all to that journey, that when we center home and people can really pursue it in how they define it, that's true freedom. And we all indirectly become stewards of these ideologies and principles that we all purport create a more just and equitable society. Thank you so much. Thank you. I want to introduce our panel and my co-conspirators. How many of you get on these calls where they say, can we have these prep calls for the panel? Yeah, okay, I don't want to do this. And sometimes you all just blankly look at each other in the screen and go, I don't understand what we're supposed to say. Well, this was one of the markers of a truly different experience. I really enjoyed the conversations that came from our Zoom chats. It really grounded what we're going to share today on the stage. So I'd like to introduce Shane Phillips, Housing Initiative Manager at UCLA's Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, Andre Brumfield, Principal and Global Leader for Cities and Urban Design with Gensler, and Catherine Gall, Executive Director at, I'm going to butcher the French, Chari, ETI of IAE Paris. Thank you. Let's give them a warm welcome.
I think I'm starting, huh?
Yes.
Okay. So I think our plan here is to have each of us just give a 5-minute or less introduction, and then I'm going to be moderating a conversation here. April, your presentation was amazing. It's the perfect kind of introduction or counterpoint to mine in a way, just in that it's so personal, so human, and I'm not those things. I'm so focused on the technical, the policy, and that's essential too.
Absolutely.
But it's really important that we have both of those things up here, and I think that we lead with the people and the stories. And so I'm not even going to take 5 minutes here, I don't think. Sorry, I just have some notes here on my phone. My questions are going to focus on trade-offs, and I think that's sort of the conversation that we had in our check-in pre-meeting a month or two ago as well, and really, acknowledging that every goal, every policy has trade-offs, and the more we get into the weeds of implementation and policy design and so forth, the more clear that becomes. So I have a book called The Affordable City. It's even here on the desk I saw, which is great. And it's really about the need to make equal priorities of these goals of housing supply, housing stability, and housing subsidies, because different people have different needs, and different communities have different needs, and these different goals achieve different things, that only when they're all put together do you really have affordability that is both sustainable and equitable. So, where the trade-offs come in here is that pursuing any individual goal, whether through zoning and building code reform, or through tenant protections like rent control and eviction protections, or subsidy programs like our Housing Choice Voucher Program, Low-Income Housing Tax Program, they're going to come with unintended consequences that to some extent are inevitable. Building more housing means changing places, tearing things down in many cases, in ways that may displace some households, at least temporarily. Tenant protections can undermine housing production. This is pretty well established in the research. And pouring more subsidies into a broken system can, at the end of the day, largely just result in higher prices with very few people served. But these problems are not intractable, and I advocate for supply stability and subsidy all alongside each other, because the strengths inherent to one of these goals often are the perfect complement to the downsides of the others. But it's really only when we acknowledge these trade-offs and look at them head on, that we can put together the right combination of policies and partners to make sure that even if a given policy, a given goal has winners and losers, as they all do, the winners of one might be the slight losers of another, and more importantly, the losers of pursuing one specific goal can be winners in other ways, so that the net benefit for them is still positive. And that's really what my work is focused on, and because I just think that conversation about trade-offs is so important, that's what I'm going to focus here with my questions today, especially I think for the benefit of the audience on our first session here, to just get us thinking about how there is no silver bullet, there is no one solution to any of these problems, there are no simple solutions to any of these problems. And so having that in our minds and really getting into what this is going to take is where I want to go. And so I think I'm going to hand it over to Andre.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Andre Brumfield, principal at Gensler, based in Chicago. And as an architect and urban designer, I've been obsessed with affordable housing and what it means to transform our communities, particularly Black communities, and a lot of the work that I've done with housing authorities across the country. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about design and the work that we do. This is moving forward. But we have had the blessing of actually working with a broad range of not only public sector clients, but also private sector clients in Chicago and across the country. This is Woodlawn Station, just south of the University of Chicago, the neighborhood's first transit-oriented development where we introduced mixed-income housing. And then we tried to raise the bar in terms of the importance of design, because we really feel that Black communities in particular have been lacking the quality of design for affordable housing. How do we actually raise the bar? We're doing that with an effort that we're working on with the City of Chicago, a different kind of public-private partnership, along with the Preservation for Affordable Housing, in introducing another 44-unit mixed-income housing development. And I do a lot of work, as I mentioned, with housing authorities, public housing, revitalizing former public housing sites. And this is an effort we're working on in the near south side of Chicago, which really brings a broad range of housing types, which I think is very important, and we should be talking about more in terms of offering a range of housing types for affordable housing. So we're doing a lot of work on the south side of Chicago, a lot of work on the west side of Chicago. And if you look closely at the map here, the orange is where you see the lowest of the low incomes, predominantly on the south side and the west side of Chicago, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. So what can affordable housing do, and how can we actually think about ways that we can reinvest in some of our most underserved communities and communities that have been lacking that investment? But with that, a lot of the neighborhoods on the south and west side have been losing Black population for decades. And this is not just here in Chicago. Over the past 30 years, actually 20 years, over 250,000 people we've lost. But this is not a new phenomenon. This is also occurring in other cities. Here in Washington, the Chocolate City capital, along with Oakland, West Coast Chocolate City capital, Black population, we're losing Black population in our cities, and also it's having really consequential impact on our neighborhoods. And speaking of neighborhoods, there's our legacy Black neighborhoods as well. How many New Yorkers in the audience? Bedford-Stuy looks a lot different today than it did 10 years ago. 22,000 Black residents no longer living in Bed-Stuy, while 30,000 new white residents and counting in Bed-Stuy. And again, unfortunately, this is not alone. Here in Washington, you know these neighborhoods, Logan Circle, Shaw, Navy Yards, much different today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Treme in New Orleans, Roxbury, and we're talking about historic Black neighborhoods have been losing Black population. So what can affordable housing do? And how can we actually stem the impact of gentrification through affordable housing and have different offerings? We're working in Nashville, City of Nashville, We all know Nashville's been white hot in terms of growth, but it's also having negative impacts on neighborhoods, particularly our black neighborhoods. We're working in the Edge Hill neighborhood, and you can see just in the last 20 years, the black population has been cut in half, 46% over the past 20 years and counting, while the white population has exploded. Gentrification in our neighborhoods, and I'm going to go through these slides very quickly, but if you could just pay attention to how the impact of gentrification and how the impact of urban renewal has actually shaped the neighborhood. This is now the impact of urban renewal. April mentioned the idea, we all know the all too familiar story of the highways coming in, bisecting our black neighborhoods, but also public housing being placed right in the center of the neighborhood. But if you look closely between these two slides, and this is the last 20 years, the impact of gentrification has been at a very small but aggressive micro scale, down to the single family lot, down to double lots, increasing the property value and pushing out black residents. But this is what's coming. 4,700 units that's planned and approved in this neighborhood alone. And if I were to go back and you just take a squint test and look at the difference in scale of the buildings to the dominant Texas donut that is going to come in, does this speak to affordability? And does it speak to the culture and preservation of our black neighborhoods? So I'm not going to get into the details of the plans where we actually tried to actually push growth, to be honest. We didn't want to accept this effort because we were like, you're 5 to 7 years too late. Gentrification is already in motion. But if we think about what cultural preservation means and what affordable housing means, this is the turnkey home in the middle. This is the only housing authority in the country that actually built single-family homes with the sole purpose of selling those homes to black residents. There were 130 of these homes that were built in the 60s. Only 17 remain today. And you can see the twin towers on both sides in terms of scale, in terms of value, and what has happened to this neighborhood to really erode the fabric of the neighborhood. And those families, those black families have been living here for the past 30 years, they're gone. So when we think about affordable housing, it's not just a single family home, it's not the Texas donut or the Texas wrap. We have to talk about a broad range of housing types when we talk about how we actually revitalize our neighborhoods. And I know there's been a lot of discussion during the pandemic. I've been part of those discussions with the 15-minute neighborhood and the 15-minute city. The frustrating thing that I have when we talk about this is we never talk about it through the lens of black neighborhoods. And what does it take to create a 15-minute black neighborhood? And it's hard to have these conversations because many of these amenities don't exist in our black neighborhoods. So how can we actually use affordable housing and pair that with other investment tools? And my dear friend, I don't know if Calvin Gladney is here today. I see Mark Norman here as well. They could talk about these other things that need to be part of the story when we talk about our black neighborhoods that build on affordable housing, but go beyond affordable housing to really settle our neighborhoods and revitalize our neighborhoods. Thank you.
You're up.
Awesome.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Shane.
I love the graphic showing that. You click the slides, just the decimation.
I'm very happy, very intimidated as well to be presenting in front of you this morning. I represent a research team in Paris, and I guess following what Andre just shared and also what April shared, I'm really honored to present some of our thinking around the high-level city scale of housing. So we are a team of multidisciplinary researchers in geography, in architecture, in urban design, but also in management, urban policy, and sociology. And at core, our question is, in which city or territory do we want to live? And I'm not speaking this morning about the architectural style or the urban form, but really about the metabolism of the city. We saw up on the poll earlier that you responded that when you don't have affordable housing, what you lose is diversity, is vibrancy, community. Well, that's what we are talking about. And I'm bringing this international perspective based on our research as a sort of inspiration and reminder of what was said earlier this morning, but let me just pause on this. We've accepted the unacceptable, and this became really visible with COVID because the entire planet was locked down everywhere, from east to west, to south to north. We had to live within the boundary of a neighborhood, and that really started to showcase the inequality and the vulnerability of some neighborhoods, whether they were segregated or not, but with access to essential services. And if you correlate health data about what COVID created, and I'm not simply talking about the symptoms of COVID, but the mental health difficulty and the crisis that followed, then I guess you see why we are here this morning. We've specialized around studying urban proximities, and it's been popularized around the 15-minute neighborhood, the 20-minute neighborhood. Our scientific director, Carlos Moreno, he spent a decade creating the theory around that, but the concept started very early on. It's actually the only way at some point you were designing a city around what people were doing, what they had to do around grocery shopping, around going to work, around health services and providers, around learning needs for children and adults, around culture, public spaces, and around housing. And those 6 urban functions that you see on the left-hand side of the visual is the ontology. It's the framework we study to actually evaluate the quality. You could argue that it's the health of a neighborhood. And really, you heard this scale of the neighborhood earlier on, because it's the only way we are going to change the city, when you understand that the city is a system of neighborhoods. And so we've developed a methodology. We truly believe that housing will improve when you improve, as Andre just mentioned, access to services, shortening distance to work, so whether it's 15 minutes, 20, 42 is really not the point. Although we do work with isochrone studies, so we develop geographical representation of where are the shops, where are the housing, which type of housing, where are the cultural activities, the museum, the theater, where are the restaurants, the hotels, the schools, and so on. And that creates dashboards and identity for neighborhoods. You see in the middle that in Korea, and if you think of a place on the planet that that is constrained to density, it's South Korea, for example, but there would be many other examples. They are also looking at that, a desaturating city by creating other types of places to live, to work, to shop, and so on. And then on the right-hand side, it's the implementation of the concept around 20-minute neighborhood in Australia, in Victoria. I could have shown Paris, but I guess you would have told me right away, this is Paris. The city was built before cars came up, so, that doesn't really transfer very well. Well, many other cities and many other urban stories have started, and we've replicated the fact that we've zoned cities, corporate business district, housing, cultural area, leisure area, university campuses. And that was supported by access to speed through cars, sometimes public transportation. But today, because of many reasons, but let's start with housing inequality and social inequality, but climate change is right there. When you cannot open your window in downtown city centers, when the air is bad, when there's noise pollution, when there are no children out, which, when you don't see fishes in a pond or birds in the forest, you sort of think it's not a healthy environment. Well, it's the same. When there isn't any life in the street, when you can't leave your children going alone to school, that's a problem. And why should we accept that? And I think through this research and through the work we do, we propose another approach. So you're going to ask me, what are the connections with this and housing? Well, it's because housing is one function of the 6 I mentioned. But if you only focus on housing and if you don't develop the system, it's not going to work. So it's not just about rethinking the housing structure, which is super important because family structures have changed And the evolution and the dynamic also of the demographies have really changed, and they are very different in different places around the world. But it's about the mixity that Andre was talking about to fight gentrification. It's about also reclaiming time by thinking about jobs that can do telework and jobs that can take place in the city, so reclaiming space for workplaces, for example, but also for nature in our city, because the next frontier will be how we develop our own micro-agricultural field, and also how we develop our new connection to nature, because we can't live without that, and biodiversity is at risk. So it's not a research around defining boundaries and ghettoizing the city, 15 minutes or 20 or whatever. It's really about rethinking with proximity. The proximity doesn't mean the same for a family and a single parent with a stroller and a teenager that can run very fast and so on. So we study persona. We study the different needs of persona. I'll go back on this one. To substantiate this research, because we believe that the theory and the thinking is something that can be inspiring. It's also a common language. We have requests and we have questions from people, from citizens, from students. We cannot even support the request for PhD work and thesis direction, because it's so important, because it crosses over so many fields. You think of health. How do you distribute your health center within a territory if you don't think of a healthy neighborhood that has those balanced needs between those different functions? We have created an observatory. We are supported by UN Habitat, the C40 group of cities, the cities that fight climate change, and also UCLG, which is another network of cities. And with our PhD, we are researching all the projects that are actually starting to address proximity and implement it in urban planning documents. With C40, we have created a forum for cities, urban designers, and urban professionals to actually share best practices, because you need to start at the neighborhood level. Of course, some cities have started to document whole urban policy documents. So Ireland, for example, has just adopted proximity-oriented urban planning for the entire country. And then each city has to show how it's going to take place. So the 15-minute city approach, or urban territories and urban proximities, is a backdrop. It's a framework for really addressing neighborhood inequalities and helping climate change, helping biodiversity restoration, and helping well-being and support for our children. On the right-hand side, you probably don't see that, but those are some examples of underused neighborhood or typical neighborhood we could start working on in a very practical reason by working with them. And my last slide is around understanding that we have different needs around proximity, as I was mentioning. A person on a wheelchair, a person with a disability, we really need to have things in close proximity. So for them, it's not even a nice to have. It's, if I want to be self-sufficient, if I want to enjoy my neighborhood, I need to have choices of places I can go to. And if I can quote Jane Jacobs, it's not about just having one choice of your bakery, your coffee, or your fitness shop. It's around choices, because that's what the city is supposed to address. You being able to fulfill your need for choices. So it's an example of how we documented a project in Luxembourg, where the Luxembourg city is building a new housing complex. And we demonstrated to them that to attract multifamily tenants, to attract young professional, students, elderly, and to mix them in that housing complex, we can document the need they have. And if you know you're going to have families with young children, then you need to open new classes in daycare, in primary school, in higher education. You also need to have different health practitioners, from the pediatrician to the oncologist to many others. So it's helping, like April talked to us, deconstruct some of the functional system to reconstruct a different balance. And to answer my first question, if you ask me in which city or territory I want to live, I want to live in a place where I have environment that is a thriving environment, where local jobs can be an option and people don't have to move out away and have to make a trade-off between living someplace and working in another place. I want to be able to have access to things I can change in my city. Participatory activities are very important. Today, cities have to engage more discussion with their citizens and their inhabitants. I mean, you see those 9 key principles. They are really at the foundation of what we believe a city that would address urban proximity would need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. As my moderator's prerogative here, I just want to call out AARP and how wonderful it was to have Rodney speak here, because just thinking about this holistic approach, AARP has stood out to me as an organization that you would not necessarily associate with housing and land use policy and advocacy, but they've seen how this affects their members, and they've really gotten involved across the whole, across everything. They don't have just one focus. And it's so valuable to have organizations like that are not the usual suspects, that show up, and when policymakers hear oh, why is the AARP talking about this zoning code reform in our city, they really take notice, and it registers in a different way and really pushes things forward. So it's great to have you here. I know we didn't really talk about how bad things are for people, and I think maybe it's just obvious at this point. I really liked what April said, though, about your students. And I work at UCLA, which is one of the most expensive university neighborhoods in the country. Students are doubling or quadrupling up in rooms and paying $1,100 or $1,500 per person per month for the privilege. It is just so insanely bad. I'm almost 40, so I'm removed from this a little bit. But not that far removed. I remember when I was, just 20 years ago, I was really struggling. And there was a point where I was living with 5 friends in a house that had no heat, and I was paying $200 a month and sleeping with a beanie and gloves on. And I was struggling to do that. I was living off Doritos, literally. And so just thinking about, since that time, prices have doubled, tripled, quadrupled, how dire the straits are for a lot of people and how urgent this problem is, I think is really important. So let me get into my first question, which is not really about housing in a way. It's really to acknowledge, we're here at a summit about housing affordability, but so we can talk about land use and design, we can talk about subsidies and incentives, we can talk about protections and mandates, but as much as housing is and seems to be at the root of a lot of our problems today, it is not the only thing we need to deal with. And if we tried to solve all of these problems just through housing-related reforms, we would fail. And so I want to give us the opportunity here, and I'm just going to ask for one thing from each of you, and just very briefly, what is something that we need to address alongside housing, that if we don't tackle this other thing, we are going to, no matter what we do on housing, it's just not going to be enough. And this is not to say that these housing reforms aren't important, they're not worth our time, that they won't make a difference, but it's really to kind of bridge these connections between what we as housing practitioners or people interested in housing can accomplish and the partnerships we need to build with others to make sure that we're going to actually get all the way there. I'll put 2 out there really quickly just to kind of prime folks. One is, I think if we don't deal with wealth and income inequality, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle where on the one hand you have people with very, very high incomes and a large share of people. I mean, we're talking 15, 20, 25% of the population making much more than the rest of the population, and they're sort of driving the high prices for everyone. Everyone is paying the cost that they're able to afford. On the other hand, you have a widening at the bottom as well, where more and more people are reliant on public resources, and that is its own challenge. It's harder for them to sustain themselves. Another one, which is going to be more controversial, and I'm going to leave it free of all nuance so that you can challenge me on this later if you choose to, is I don't think we're going to solve the racial wealth gap through housing.
Right.
I think
That's right.
we cannot keep propping up home values more and more and more as a way to solve that problem. We've already come too far, in fact. we can't, once again, double, triple, quadruple home prices in order to equalize things. But then there's a real challenge. I'm going to insert some nuance here just because I can't resist myself. There is the reality that we've created all this wealth mostly for white folks through this system. And now here's a white homeowner saying, well, we can't do that anymore. And so I fully acknowledge that's a real challenge and something that has to be worked through. But I really do think that as important as housing is, it really needs to kind of go back to what it used to be, which was a form of security, not a form of wealth. And we're going to need to take other actions like race-neutral baby bonds and race-conscious reparations as strategies for actually addressing the wealth gap problem. So I'll pass it on to, we haven't heard from April in a while, I'm sure people would love to. What's your pitch for this?
I think you're spot on with this concept of reparations. When I do a lot of my lectures or workshops, we speak about reparations to democracy. We know that we've built what we have had today based on this concept, again, that all of us are equal, but in practice, that wasn't the reality. I think one of the biggest things that are missing that we're not going to be able to solve for the housing challenges is a new form of pedagogy that shifts the perceptions and mental models of this current system. I can't tell you how many times I've come across people that really don't understand sort of the full details of redlining or the New Deal policies. Yeah. So when you speak to someone in this concept of this bootstrap mentality, you know, you sit down with someone and you say, hey, you know, prior to that whole 15 to 30 year mortgage opportunity, you essentially had to put 30 to 50% down to buy a home. And you typically had terms of 5 to 7 years to pay it off. But this country experienced something called the 1929 market crash, the Great Depression. So that opportunity to actually do the 5 to 7 year refinance no longer existed. So of course the banks and the insurance companies were too big to fail. So the government stepped in. And that's when they created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, followed by the Federal Housing Administration. With the Homeowners Loan Corporation, we revolutionized the mortgage instrument. That's how we get to the 15 to 30 year mortgage with the low down payment. That did not exist prior. So when you create this phenomenal policy, because it worked, it's an example of a policy that worked and built wealth over time, but it was excluded on who can actually access that piece of legislation. And when you start telling people that, hey, think about you buying a home with a GI Bill or little to down payment, you have 15 to 30 years to pay it off, and this massive public investment is being made into the infrastructure of the suburbanization of America, but yet you have within the deeds of these homes restrictive covenants of who can purchase these homes. You had restrictive deeds. So people like my mom were forced into places like the Bronx instead of having to go to Levittown, Long Island. So when you break that down and you say, well, let's look at how that builds wealth into the issues of the gaps that we deal with today, someone was building wealth while others were not building wealth, and it was being destroyed.
And some of that wealth was built through that exclusion.
Absolutely. And when you start, when people sit with that and you remove this concept of race from it and this concept of freedom and opportunity, it becomes a very different conversation with individuals. It's one of healing. It's one of better understanding. It's like, I only hear this term redlining, but the nuances of those blocks are not explained. So for me, I really think that we're not going to be able to solve if we're not better educated. And we have a lot of educating to do in our society.
Andre, how about you?
Well, I think building on that last point in terms of education, I think this is an opportunity for us to rethink or, you know, talk about affordable housing, the term, in a much different way. And look, you know, if you talk to black folks on the south side of Chicago or my hometown of Milwaukee, and you say affordable housing, the first thing that they think about in their neighborhoods, like, the project folks are coming, right? That's not necessarily it. When you talk about affordable housing in the suburbs, you know, to that family who has secured their $750,000 home and their large plot, you talk about affordable housing, you know, they will say, there's a reason why I, quote, left the city, because I don't want those folks coming here. But if we think about affordable housing, you mentioned student housing, that's one, you know, I want to do away with terms like attainable housing and workforce housing, because those are just kind of, nice, soft, political kind of language, depending on where you're working in the country, so you can't say affordable housing. So I think if we talk about what affordable housing really means for us as a society, and it's not just color,
That's right.
right? It's not just race. We know it's income. And if you want to talk about the other ways that actually get coupled with affordable housing to help kind of, reestablish particularly our Black and brown neighborhoods and some of our most distressed areas and underserved areas across the country, employment is tied right to that. So how can we actually talk about employment opportunities that get coupled with affordable housing opportunities, among many other things? And just one other point I want to make. How many developers in the audience? So hopefully none of my clients are part of this group. But I've actually said this to my clients. One of the frustrating things that I've actually found throughout my career is our developers who are only relying on low-income housing tax credits to advance their deals.
That's right.
Okay? If they don't, we know those tax credits are precious, the 9% are precious. If you get it, great. If you don't get it this round, we'll apply for next year. And meanwhile, that property sits. It sits vacant. It actually, you find more challenges, and we've certainly seen throughout COVID with the cost of, rising cost of construction and materials, the delays, everything has gone up. So if we can actually find other ways where we can actually produce true affordable housing and create mixed income communities where we're not relying on those low-income housing tax credits or the 4% or the 9% and new market tax credits. And there are developers who are doing it, but we really need to explore different ways and not just relying on that as a main piece of our capital stack to advance our efforts.
Catherine?
Yeah, I'm going to echo this as well. Employment would be right high on our list, and definitely I hope I'm leaving you with this idea of the circularity of a neighborhood. And so local employment, but also local food chain, for example, would be very important because, again, we've accepted to have cheap stuff be coming our way from China, from overseas. We are not understanding the total cost of all of that. And in the affordable housing picture, it's not just the cost of renting and having a place, it's how far are you from your workplace, and so what is your transportation costs, what are the cost of buying everything you need and of the school for your children or for your own education. And that's why we believe that we need to address first the decency and the livability of housing, but then recreating those smaller scale infrastructures of services, of equipment, understanding the diversity and mixity of people, because like we said, everyone on this planet wants to be part of a community. Every one of us was born someplace. Some of us were very lucky that we had some choices. Many others, as we heard, don't. And you don't move out a neighborhood by choice if you're happy, if you're lucky. And there are all kinds of housing cycles you go through. You're a co-location when you're a student, and then you become a couple, and then you raise your family, and then at some point you pick a place for living towards the end of your life, and so on. But it's by choice, and that's what is really important to have, which is not the case for a lot of people. Co-location
is a very kind euphemism for describing my housing situation when I was 18. Andre, I wanted to ask you a question. Again, this is going to be like a tension trade-off question. You talked about Black population loss in certain neighborhoods, many neighborhoods, and I think this you mentioned this idea of disinvestment, and I think there's a real challenge now where you have communities that for generations were disinvested. They were marginalized. When investment came in, it was urban renewal, it was freeways, destroying communities and so forth. Now it's almost the opposite problem. It's now there's a fear of investment, especially outside investment and gentrification. And so how do you think about the tension between those things where these communities want investment, but they also worry that that investment is going to mean their community improves, but they don't get to enjoy it, they have to leave?
Well, I mean, I think that's, the big mystery question. How do we solve for that? How do residents benefit from this change that's coming in, or the investment that's finally coming in, and what protections can you put in place? I think there's a policy side of this as well. I think there's the education side of this, as well, for those residents who may not know that there are resources out there that they can actually, get access to make sure that they actually stay in their home, and more importantly, they're able to afford their home that they live in. But if you have, Mrs. Brumfield, my mother, 76 years old, who actually fought to buy her home, has owned it for the last 45 years. She's on a fixed income. She wants to stay in her neighborhood, but her taxes are going up and up and up. What are the policies that we can actually put in place to keep Mrs. Brumfield, my mother, in her home? Or, hey, this is still America. She may choose to sell her home. Now, how do we make sure that she gets not fair value, but maximum value that may actually create a different kind of wealth? We can't take that off the table, right? But in too many cases, in the example I actually put up there with in Nashville, in the Edge Hill neighborhood, those families may have controlled their home, in air quotes, but they are wrapped up in second and third and fourth mortgages, So what are those resources that we can actually give to those families to help them untangle that, where they can actually still stay in place and benefit from the change?
I want to ask a follow-up and maybe just pose this to you, April, just to mix it up. I think there's another tension here where black population loss or any community kind of deconcentrating, there's an element of maybe some displacement is happening, maybe people can no longer afford it and have to move. But there's also increasing choice. Things are not equal, but they are certainly better because of the Fair Housing Act and other things that have been done over the past generations. People have the freedom to make the moves that white people were able to make in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. And so how do you think about that, the mix of wanting to keep communities together, but also people having their own agency and many actually wanting to move to the suburbs and maybe having this continuity is not their priority?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's building off of these themes. When we look at this concept of power of choice or freedom of choice, right? There's this theory of it. It all sounds great that people may have this desire to live in a different community, but then there's the reality of what that constitutes. So, just from my work and the lived, not just my personal experiences, but traveling across this country with the exhibition on Design the Red Line and people understanding these bigger concepts, we don't have the financial tools in place. Right. That is just the reality that gives us freedom of choice. Because as you're saying, I wanted to live in the Bronx neighborhood. Again, it's desirable for me. But the financial tools did not exist to allow me to do that. So I had to be forced to be mobile to go into another community. The house that I was sharing in my presentation literally is 15 minutes away from Princeton, New Jersey. So as an architect looking at the typologies, I found one in Princeton. It's a $3.5 million home. I don't find Princeton desirable for me, nor can I afford to find it desirable. So my point in saying this is that there is this tension here, and people do want to leave and want to explore. But I think what Catherine says hits on what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor wrote in her book, Race for Profit, where it's this exploration of this concept of how do we define wealth. And for many of us, in choosing to leave, it's not necessarily have to be associated that we want to maximize value. The work that we're doing in Trenton is to create accessible housing, not in the ADA recommendation, but that you don't start building hierarchy with this terminology, but you have the right financial tools in place that allow you to play. I'm a homeowner that would like to participate in a mortgage program where my interest goes to support the ecology, right? And it's not individual wealth, it's community wealth we're building. And what that means is that if I should choose to sell my home, I can then give up a portion of my equity back into a fund that allows me or those who come after me to be able to live there. And I'm willing to do that because I have a very different definition of wealth. So people have a right to freely move, but the reality of how they practice that moving, particularly in the cultural aspects. We always hear these stories of gentrified neighborhoods and the music playing in the middle of the night and the neighbors calling the police and creating more threat and danger to existing populations. Trayvon Martin, just walking in a neighborhood. I don't want to live in those neighborhoods. I don't want my family members to be stopped. I don't want my neighbor to say, what are you doing? Or it's not for me. And actually Trenton is a very diverse community. My block comprises of all different people that chose to stay for that reason. And they're not in it for wealth or how to flip their home. They want rootedness in place. And I think that's another part of the pedagogy that we have to begin to bring out, that not everyone's seeking to buy a home or live in a community to maximize wealth. And when we anchor that, we begin to affect the ecology instead of just affordable housing.
Yeah.
You give power of choice.
Yeah. I do think we have a challenge where, because housing has gotten so expensive, it's put people on the defensive, where they actually do feel in some ways like they need that wealth, because if they don't have that, who's going to look after them in the future? How are they going to ever, if they want to improve their own home, like if they're just going to fall behind, if their home is not increasing in value but everyone else's is, what's that going to look like? I think these are real challenges. And this kind of relates to both what you're saying and I think to what Catherine is working on as well. I think part of what's happening here is we have very targeted investments that are taking place, or will change policies in a specific neighborhood or a specific corridor. And to many people, we make that community or corridor or city nicer, somehow more attractive to people. But because there are so few places like that receive that investment, those few become very valuable and very expensive. And so I think there's something to this idea of us needing to invest more and more broadly in a way where no particular community is like the place you gotta be.
That's right.
But everywhere is a place that people would be happy to be. And then they get to pick based on the community and the kind of human factors and not just whatever they can afford.
It's a decentralizing of this power.
Yeah.
Or centering this power into one dynamic. And to me, again, we have to go back and look at the financial tools. We don't have them in play right now. And we depend on LIHTC and all these other, and when you look at how that trickles down, I'm not sure about many of you, but when I walk around my neighborhoods or what I'm seeing, the carbon footprint that is left in these affordable, and you're talking about it very importantly with how the materiality and how we're bringing in. All of these places, or many of them, are crumbling after 3 to 5 years. Whereas you looked at what was built in the 1930s and 40s, those have endured the test of time. So when we're looking at these different aspects of desirability, again, in a neighborhood, the pushback, we have to sit and reimagine what that can be. It's not a foo-foo kumbaya, oh, let's envision this. It was done before. And we can do it again if we want to. Because we can do it right now. And if we diversify
we could build it 100 years ago.
Yeah.
It seems like we could build it now.
We did it before, and we can do it now. It's a power of choice, and not everyone is centralized on this, I want to build value. You give me a good school, you give me a good grocery store, you give me walkability, all these things that they're trying to say are new concepts that have been existing in neighborhoods for centuries already. I'm not moving from that neighborhood, and I don't care about whether it goes up significantly or not, as long as that ecosystem is thriving. And that begins to create more supply for choices of where we want to live.
Yeah. Catherine, I want to turn it over to you. So I'm a very big supporter of the concept of 15-minute cities. I didn't own a car for the past 12 years until last year, finally. I was kind of forced into it. It's just, LA is tough. But, I think you started to get at this in your introductory presentation. I think about a place like Los Angeles. Los Angeles, contrary to maybe people's expectations, has a pretty great transit system by US standards, at least. at least much better than just about anywhere else in the country, save a few cities. But we're still very car-oriented, and we're making the right choices largely. We're investing in transit, we're putting more housing near transit and in more walkable and bikeable communities. We are eliminating parking minimums, so you don't have to build 1.5 or 2 parking spaces per unit and drive up costs and kind of encourage more driving. We're doing mostly the right things. Not enough, not fast enough, but we're moving in the right direction. The challenge is we're so far from that ideal of a place like Paris, and the ideal for many of us, at least for me. We're so far from that every new building that gets built, most people who live there, they're still going to want the car, because we're not there yet. We're not at a place where most people feel comfortable living without a car in a garage, accessible to them right away. As you said, Paris was never a car city. It was built up before that for the most part. And so I'd like to hear you talk about maybe what we can and cannot learn from Paris, or how there might be different lessons or a different path for us, and maybe other cities that could be a better example for the places like many US cities that grew up around the car, and it's going to take just a lot of change, radical change that's going to take decades, if not generations, to get to that ideal end state.
I'm really happy to share learnings and insights from Paris, but I actually happened to spend some time here. I lived in this country 4 years in Michigan, and the first time I ever heard about urban proximities was when I visited Portland, and I think it was 20 years ago. And they were introducing the 20-minute neighborhood, and it was because they had to relocate jobs and people within the city, and they worked on their transit system. And they started to understand they were also very committed to net zero building, net zero neighborhood. And so it's a systems of things you have to put in place. So of course, Paris was built and designed and redeveloped way back a couple of centuries ago, and it was not for the cars. But slowly and step by step, the city had to address the car issues, and based on a lot of things you know here very well, we've expanded the streets, we created this motorway around the city, and today it is as difficult for Paris to get away from that circle as it would be for any US cities, Korean cities, Australian cities, or any cities around the world. So it's no different, that part, that we have developed an addiction, an abuse of what we do with cars. And I am not in a crusade against cars. I actually happen to have one. It's an electric car because I live in a suburb. I don't live downtown Paris, and I have to have a car to get to a public point to actually then hop up on the public transportation. And we totally understand that in many cases cars are very important, but it's the symbol of the car. It's the type of car. It's how you use your car. In France, we do a lot of transportation survey, and cars are mostly used to run 4 kilometers, 3 miles or 2.5 miles. So it's really a new cultural sort of movement to redefine your mobility, and redefine your mobility having in mind the indirect cost of moving. Do you want to contribute to carbon footprint? Do you want to actually contribute to your own health by walking, cycling, using another type of transportation? Do you want to actually enjoy also the surroundings of where you are versus not looking at anything and not being with anyone? There was just a study released around the car sharing system and also the shared riding in cities. It's so small. People don't use it because you're losing your liberty because you have to agree with someone to meet at some point to do the same ride every day and so on. And that's against our concept of liberty. But then let's redefine what you want to do. Do you want to be in a car with other people discussing, socializing, and then you have to give up a little bit on your own sleeping time, eating time, whatever, because you have to get organized with them? Or do you want to be on your single car, one person in a car, on that special lane in the city? And so the research we do is agnostic around cars. Personally, again, I'm not against cars, and none of us on the team is, but we have to recognize that the symbolic of driving, the symbolic of transportation has changed. But again, going back 20, 30 years ago, the number of cars per family was much lower than it became today. And the car is like a family member. You know, when I'm in Germany and I speak in conferences or in doctoral school to my German colleagues, they go like, no, it's like, you know, we love our cars, we love our BMW, Mercedes, and so on. And it's true for many other parts of the planet. So cities are meant for people. Cities are meant to be out in the streets, having access to nature, being able to find in a short distance, using hopefully decarbonated transportation what you need, and being able also to actually drive out and go places with a car if you have access to, for example, a shared system. But let's reprioritize that, and let's deprioritize the streets versus the people, the housing needs, and also the future example for our children. In Paris, I'm going to close with that, one of the decisions that the mayor took some years ago was to create pedestrianized access to the schools. They are called school streets, because we studied that if we allow parents to actually take a bicycle, walk, take public transportation to drop off children, then chances are the next segment will not be done with a car. And you could take, you know, Uber, on-demand transportation, whatever, but at least that portion of your very important moment in the day, your child will learn that he can walk on the pavement in the city and not be always in a car, in sort of a cocoon that is over-dominating the landscape of our cities.
Yeah, I think sometimes when we talk about changing cities, it's interpreted as like people shouldn't be able to live in the suburbs. They shouldn't be able to have that lifestyle. But I think what's not really appreciated is that if you want the Paris or even something approaching that, that's the lifestyle that's completely unavailable to most Americans. If you want the suburban lifestyle, there are many places to find it. What I think a lot of us are trying to build, among other things, is a place where that kind of option is actually even feasible. And I mean, just as a sign of how desirable that lifestyle is, the few places in our country that offer it are the most expensive places in the country. People really pay a premium to live that kind of lifestyle, which again goes back to the sort of spreading the love a little bit here. So I think we have 8 or so minutes. So I'm going to ask my last big question here, which is going to be very hard to answer for each of you in 2 minutes, but that's what I'm going to ask of you. So a lot of this work is about envisioning a different future, which I think to a lot of us here is exciting, but it can be scary or threatening to many other folks. You know, on the one hand, I think if you're a member of a marginalized community, of a historically oppressed community, someone showing up with big plans for a radically different future might conjure up, you know, memories or family memories of urban renewal and freeway investments through Black communities, and the New Deal, which did all these great things but largely excluded Black households. On the other hand, if you are fairly comfortable, then radical changes might sort of unseat your place in the social and economic hierarchy. And so it might not be something that you're really on board with either. And so the question I want to pose to each of you is, and you can answer this as narrowly as or as widely as you like within 2 minutes, is what is our promise to both of those groups? What is the message to those worried that change will come at their expense, either because that's how their community's been treated in the past, or on the other hand, this group of people who worry that they have a lot to lose and maybe are not convinced that there's much for them to gain. So just thinking about both of those groups, because they represent a lot of people. And if we don't get both of those groups on board in some meaningful way, I don't know that all this grand planning is going to amount to much, because the politics do matter. So what's our promise to the people who are afraid of change and feel like they think it's going to harm them more than help them, either because they are historically marginalized or because they're already doing pretty good? So who wants to start? Actually, I want to have April close us, so I'll go this way.
Yeah, because I
Catherine, can you start?
I don't want to follow April.
No.
It's a really big question, and I know you would ask it, but I guess on one hand, we see every day, like I mentioned, requests from communities from around the world, including from North America, from students, from academia, from just citizens saying, I miss so many things in my neighborhood. Can you help me, and can you help us design the future? So that piece we understand very well. On the other side, a lot of our research work is targeting institutions. It's the Climate Week, and it was the SDG Action Weekend this weekend. I mentioned the work we do with UN Habitat, with C40 cities. So there is a level of executive decision-making people who understand that as well, because who can not see today that we can no longer live the way we've lived, and that somehow maybe luxury today will be to have a very small carbon footprint on this planet, and not what we live by every day. So that's how we look at it.
Andre?
I'll try to be quick. As an architect and urban designer throughout my career, I've had 4 clients, and usually 3 of those clients are working together on a given project. There's the private sector, the developers. There's the public sector, which may be the Department of Housing, Department of Planning, Department of Economics. There's the nonprofits who we work with. And then there's the 4th, which is those are our 3 contractual clients. But our spiritual client is the community. And I can tell you this right now, and luckily I've not been a victim of this, any one of those 4 can get you fired, especially your spiritual client, the community. So the idea of real engagement and outreach, those are 2 different things, okay? Community engagement and community outreach is critical. For me as an architect and urban designer, the best ideas often come from the neighborhoods, and they come from the residents. Why? Because they live there. But I think, when we talk about change and preparing for change, it's convincing a resident that while they face day-to-day challenges, whether it's through jobs, through employment opportunities, through, the massive amount of stress that they have with day-to-day life just to live, that there is a future here 5 years out from now, 7 years out from now, 10 years out from now. And this is an opportunity to not only be part of it or give us your feedback. I don't like that. It's about how you can actually have a voice in creating change instead of vision for the future. That is one of the toughest challenges, because people like me who are a little bit older than some other people on the stage, we know that 10 years goes by very fast, and development and change with that happens very fast in our communities like that. So how can we actually convince the residents that change is coming? They can be part of this change, they can influence this change while they still deal with their day-to-day struggles in some cases. I think that's, the real tension. But residents respect when you actually give them the truth. Residents respect when you actually tell them what's going on. And even if they don't like it, they will respect that because you as a consultant are giving them the truth, and they need to hear that from us.
And I think if you do that real engagement, you actually might be able to bring in the people who are showing up because they want to improve the thing, not the people who normally just show up because they oppose the thing outright.
Well,
you know what I mean?
And with that, there's ownership.
Yeah.
That they can actually have ownership in this change, whether they actually acknowledge it at that moment or not. But hopefully it's the beginning of something different.
That's right.
April?
I love what
Close us
you
out.
all are saying. And Catherine, when you were speaking about the ride share, what immediately was conjured in my mind was the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was a ride share that really dismantled the system of segregation in public transportation. Think about it on that level of manifesting change. It's not something that happened, that is new. It happened already. We brought down an entire system on it. I think that this hybridity of healing is going to be very central. We have been conditioned, and our perceptions have taken over on what we perceive to be loss or gain. It's not a zero-sum game. We've been sold that, and we've bought into that, and we have to change it. Part of changing it is this public engagement. People are like, what is, traveling across the country and putting an exhibit out there called Democracy Is. We held our first living room talk in Trenton, New Jersey, where we opened the house and it's completely gutted. And we invited people from all different backgrounds in a living room with food to break bread with one another, not in some staged community space with Post-its. And we began to get down and drill in so that you could see me and I can see you. We have not given ourselves that opportunity in this society. We have been robbed of that. We have been robbed of what we can really do. It's not about shaming or blaming. It's about how do we scale our collective humanity. And that's what's at stake here, our collective humanity. And you're gonna have to make a choice. What side? Is it $10,000 and then the planet burns? Or we continue to see what we're seeing in our society? What price are we paying for that?
All right, can we thank our panelists and speakers?